I don't have a strong enough understanding of the history of Russia. So I almost want you to talk me through this, explain me to the main parts about the history of Russia, and also give me a lens into, because my assumption is with this, and there's kind of a hint in there. I think there's a hint in where you say there was always someone in the West rushing to justify the bloodshed. There is a lens into what's happening in the world currently.
I will leave that to the reader to do their extrapolations.
Yeah.
I really hate this kind of idea that everything in the past is necessarily replicated. You know, like I'll give you like an example. When Mayor Bloomberg, who was mayor of New York after Giuliani, he was having a ban on like large sodas at 7-Eleven. Like you couldn't buy a supersized soda. And Mike Huckabee, who was governor at the time, I believe, of Arkansas, was like, this is just like North Korea. And I'm like, shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have soda in North Korea. It's if they could have their small sodas with some calories, they would, you know, so calm down. So I'm very wary of when people are like, oh, you know, part of the reason I wrote this is I was on a conservative podcast and they were going on about how Biden's a communist. And I'm like, do you even know what communism is? Like you're using this word. Like, do you know what life is like under these regimes? It's not some senile old coot, you know, on TV wagging his finger at you or you know, having CRT in the classrooms. And the thing I realized is I don't even know what it's like. I mean, I was born there. We came here when I was 2, but like I didn't have any sort of understanding of just how horrific it was. But to your point, there is the one takeaway that is spot on is many of these organizations that were carrying the water for this nightmare regime are still in place today. So it's a valid comparison to say the New York Times, which did everything in its power to obscure Stalin's starvation of millions of Ukrainians, is still the paper of record. You know, it's the Atlantic, it's the New Republic. This isn't metaphors or analogies. It's literally the same organizations. So insofar as I don't even know if you call it a parallel, if it's literally the same place or the same outlet that's, you know, was in place then and is in place now.
Because it was that like, because when we read it through, I was like, okay, this sounds like something I need to understand more about. I want to understand this history and I'll read the book for the history. But that line stood out. There was always someone in the West rushing to justify their bloodshed. And we were questioning ourselves, well, what does that mean? Because I didn't know you meant the Atlantic. I didn't know you meant the New York Times.
Yeah.
I hadn't read the book yet. We were trying to like say, well, I mean, is that the same as us? Is that us buying an iPhone from China when the Uyghurs are being enslaved? Like, what is it? You know, are we ourselves? Are we, you know, complicit?
No. That's not what I meant at all about the average person being complicit. What I meant is there was a letter that was signed by 500 leading Americans, influencers, right? And there was someone from every university, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, so on and so forth. You had a bunch of people who worked for the New Yorker. You had a bunch of prominent writers, and they were just making these claims about. So this is before the internet. This is before television, right? This is the 30s. So you are looking to these people to be the intellectual class. They're the ones who understand things. They're the ones who kind of spell out, well, what does this mean, right? It's the Chris Cuomo of their time, so to speak, in some ways, or more accurately, Samantha Bee, because many of them were humorous. And they were saying explicitly in writing that what you're hearing about the Soviet Union is wrong. They do have freedom of speech. They can read any of the great books you want, from Aristotle to Lenin. And you know, you see this in writing and you're like, this is insane. And this is at a time when in these countries, if you had a book that was banned, you're going to a labor camp and possibly your whole family. So to have, it wasn't some kind of like opinion thing where it's just like, they have freedom of speech in their own way, but sure, they ban hate speech. They were lying to people in the West about everything that was being done. And the things that were being done were not ambiguous. The New York Times headline, front and center, said, there is no starvation in the Soviet Union. The Russians are merely tightening their belts. So it's not some sort of left versus right, Republican, Democrat, you know, is Boris Johnson a loudmouth, is Trump an asshole? They were lying about what was being done to millions of people over decades. And it's many of the same organizations that are still in place today, and they have never been held accountable. And the fact that even I, as someone who was born in the Soviet Union, had very little idea of just what was going on there over the decades also speaks to the lack of interest in many Western media circles about basic human rights violations if the narrative doesn't suit their purposes.
What was their incentives to lie about it?
So Eugene Lyons was a communist and a reporter, and he got sent to the Soviet Union to be their man in Moscow because they knew he'd have an in there, and he did. And when he saw what was going on there, he completely turned, and he's just like, this is horrific. And I quote him in the book. He described it as the guinea pig model, because they had this, I don't know if fantasy is the word, but this vision of what a society could look like. And the Soviet Union was promised to be a scientific society. It was scientific socialism. In the West, you have these plutocrats, these capitalists, these monopolists, these, like, why is it right that Elon Musk gets to own Twitter? Like, who's this asshole, right? Their version is, all right, if you have the government managing everything for everyone, it's going to work out, and you're not going to have this one random rich person having all these power over people's lives. And there's something to that. There's a internal logic to it. And his point was, they didn't care what was done to the people in Russia, because you have to experiment on someone, right? So let's see if this new society, and it was a new society, there hadn't been a nation like it anywhere previously. So you can make the argument with a straight face, this is the society of the future, because it is unprecedented in many ways. Let's try it. Like, we're socialists, and there's different kinds of socialism, democratic socialism, communism, so on and so forth. And this is the variant of socialism that won. This is the first country where it identifies as socialism and tries to implement it. Let's give them every chance we have in our power to see if this system works out. It costs us nothing. And sure, the Russian people squeal, and, just like the guinea pig squeals when you experiment on it. But that was their kind of model. They're the elites, and this was their opportunity to put their ideas in practice without having to bear any of the costs, and basically having all the benefits, because then they could say, look, we told you so. We're the smart ones.
Was any part of that politically influenced because it was seen that this socialist project would weaken the Russians?
So the argument was socialism is going to be wealthier for everyone.
The argument would be, yeah.
Yes, because if you don't have that surplus value being taken by Rockefeller and Carnegie and Bill Gates, right? If he's not taking all the profits for himself and everyone's working for the sake of society, you're going to produce more. Every individual is going to keep more of their own money, so they're going to be wealthier. You're going to have advanced technology, so you're going to have to work less. It's going to be less labor intensive. And once we industrialize, because Marxism is very much an industrial revolution ideology, and we have factories everywhere, everyone's going to be wealthier and happier and better off. And that prophecy had a lot of support for itself when the Great Depression hit, because this was the look, we told you for decades, capitalism is going to implode under the weight of its own contradictions. The stock market collapses. You have unemployment, some it was like 23% or something crazy here. It's systemic. It's not changing for a decade. And they could say, look, we told you so. So since we predicted that capitalism is unsustainable, it's going to collapse of its own weight, therefore, what we're telling you as the alternative is going to work. We just have to give it a chance and industrialize Russia, and look how much progress we're making. 5 more years, they had these 5-year plans, another 5-year plan, another 5-year plan. And what's fascinating to me writing the course of this book is how many at different, how you play poker, and at different stages, you're like, I'm out, you have a bunch of people around the table, I'm out. There were different steps when people who were, committed communists or committed leftists were like, all right, this is okay. Because the thing is, they also didn't want to say I'm out and turn, because then they're siding with the right and the conservatives, who they knew are bad people, who they, from their perspective, who they knew are like, okay, I'm not for this. And these people are for the worst elements of society. So I have to be opposite to them in some capacity. But then, a big one was when Stalin makes a pact with Hitler. And for a lot of that was a big like wake up call for people on the left when they had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when they were like, whoa, okay, we can carry a lot of your water, but if you're not literally shaking hands with Hitler, this is exactly what we're against. And that was the big turning point for many people. Of course, a few years later, FDR shaking hands with Stalin, and it's kind of fine again. But there were, and I talk about in the book, different points where people were like, oh, okay, so even though the critics are despicable and I hate them, they were right.
We have the benefit of hindsight that we know this model completely doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. It's been shown time and time again. But was it created in good faith that actually this can work? Or was this a model that was created purely out of an ideology of a small group of people who knew they would maintain themselves as the elite?
But again, so Lenin was obviously the big figure here. And one of the people I discuss, two people I discuss heavily early in the book, were Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, who were hardcore communist anarchists. They were deported from the United States. Berkman tried to assassinate Frick, who was Carnegie's right-hand man. They were, someone who was a fan of Goldman, killed President McKinley here. So they were no strangers to political violence and advocating for political violence. When they get sent to Russia, early on, Lenin had to consolidate power, right? So it wasn't just the Bolsheviks. So he had to work with the Mensheviks, he had to work with the left SRs, he had to work with the anarchists, and basically form this coalition. So then they were all like, all right, the Bolsheviks basically have the megaphone, let's all work together and make this work. But once that Russian civil war was won and the forces of the Tsar, the whites, were defeated, overnight, Lenin is like, all right, and he started rounding up all these other or these other ideologies. So simply being formally a Menshevik or an anarchist, you're going to jail. And Goldman and Berkman saw this, and they were like, Berkman was in prison when the Russian Revolution happened, and he had said, this was the happiest day of my life. This was something I've been working for years, to see socialism seize power. Like, he couldn't believe it. And he says when he got deported there and landed in the Soviet Union, he wanted to kiss the ground. And he's like, this must have been what my ancestors have felt like when they encountered the Holy of Holies in the temple. And then he gave him every opportunity. And then when he fled, he's just like, this is a bigger nightmare than the worst kind of capitalist system. They are targeting, he's like, Goldman says this herself, she goes, I'm no opponent of violence. But in a revolution, in terms of creating a society for the workers, you're using the violence against the workers. These are the people we're supposed to be for. Like, you guys are monsters. And everything that Hitler and Mussolini did, you guys set the stage for them. So they were very, very, her memoir of these years was called My Disillusionment in Russia. So they were the ones who very much had their eyes open. But the fascinating thing is, when they left, Emma Goldman spoke in London, I believe it was in the late 20s. And when she read Emma, she had as much left-wing clout as anybody. She kind of always put her ass on the line. And she gives a talk, and it opens with a standing ovation. And when she was done, you could hear a pin drop. Because as she's denouncing the Soviet Union to these lefty Brits, they didn't want to hear it. And they just felt very betrayed by her, and like, how can you be saying these things? And this is, I've been to the future and it works, and this sort of situation. And it was almost as if, it was almost literally, you don't know what you're talking about, even though she had been there and they'd never left the confines of their posh homes. And that is a theme, I think, with many intellectuals, where they feel comfortable opining about places they've never been in without having done their homework. Now, obviously, I haven't been in the Soviet Union, but you do a lot of work, you see both sides. They were only interested in hearing their perspective, which is, this is going to work and it has to work.
Did any part of it work when they first started? Was there any successes, or was it just a complete abject failure?
I don't know. I mean, it worked in the sense that it became more industrialized.
Yeah.
It worked in the sense that you had increased literacy. And for example, Sputnik happened, they were the first satellite, but the question always is, at what cost? So you could say that you solve the problem of famine by starving everyone. And if you starve everyone, no one's hungry, right? So it works. So I don't know what works means in this context, but the costs of what it was done to these people, including many children, is something I had not been aware of at all. And while learning about these atrocities, was extraordinarily disturbed by.
How horrific are we talking? I mean,
I think it's much more horrific than anything I know. I'll give you just one example, and this is under Lenin. So a lot of these kids became homeless. You know, the parents died or were arrested. They were abandoned. And there were some bunch of street kids in Moscow, and they were pickpockets, little thieves, whatever, teenagers. So the secret police rounded them up, took them to the cellar of the prison, and were beating the crap out of them, asking them who your partners in crime are, literal partners in crime. Then they take the kids in the car, drive them around Moscow, and make the kids point people out. The kids they weren't members of some kind of Yakuza. They were poor street children stealing to get food. And if they didn't point people out, they were going to get the shit kicked out of them. So they would just start pointing at people at random. But the line that really disturbed me was hearing that it was the hardened prisoners, the adults, who couldn't bear hearing the sounds of the kids screaming as the kids were realized they were being returned to the jail. So when you hear things like this, it's the sort of thing that I think is something almost unimaginable. And I'll give you another example where it's just like these things make logical sense, but once they're applied with their kind of scientific logic, it becomes something so inhuman, it's almost impossible to appreciate. So how they would have collective punishments. So being married to an enemy of the people was in itself a felony, right? So if you're arrested, your wife's going to get arrested, right? And what's she going to plead? Not guilty. She was married to you. So overnight, your kids become orphans, okay? At the same time, any family that was friends with your kids now have to shun them because why are you friends? Why are you talking to Peter's kids? Oh, were you in cahoots with Peter? Is your dad an enemy of the people? So there's one story where this girl overnight becomes an orphan. Her family friend, you know, she had someone her own age. They try to take her in. They go to talk to some big shot in the government. They're like, "What do we do?" And they're like, "You should put her on the street. Like you're putting your life." And these kids go out in the street. You can imagine what happens to them. And there's hand wringing in the Kremlin about what are we going to do about all these kids who are killing themselves now. But they're killing themselves with good reason. You know, if overnight my parents are gone and no one will look at me even in school or talk to me, what am I supposed to? And it's on my record that I'm a child of the enemy of the people. What am I supposed to do? So when you hear things like this, you know, which make perfect sense given the premises of the system, it does a number on you, and I think for most people. And the thing is, that happened to Gorbachev. When he was a kid, his grandfather got arrested for supposedly being a Trotskyite or something. And he talks about how my house became a plague house. That was his words, meaning like everyone in the village just avoided it like it was radioactive. And he's a kid. Was he 5, 6, 7, 8? Now no one wants to talk to you? For what? And we don't even have that here. Imagine like if you were a murderer, you know, and you deservedly go to jail. Maybe your kids wouldn't reflect on your children. They would know their friends in school would maybe be weird, like, oh, your dad's a murderer, but it's not like I can't talk to Peter's kids anymore because maybe I'm putting my life in danger. That wouldn't be the concern.
So was it just all about maintaining control then?
It's hard to get inside the heads of the people at the top. But at the same time, you know, they themselves were often prisoners. Because if I'm an interrogator and I'm interrogating Peter and I need to break him to get a confession, if I'm in any way showing mercy to you, then my boss will be like, oh, you're colluding with him? Maybe we should check you out. So now the incentives are, even though I know you're innocent or I know you didn't do anything, I have to break you because it's my skin and my family. And if it's a choice between you, Peter, and my family, it's not going to be a hard choice.